an earthly limit, post-war Europe saw in the degenerate nature of its existing political forms and in its ineffectual economic structures a new Europe. And yes, remember, the new Europe. Let's remind ourselves that though we now speak almost exclusively of the European Union, earlier references to that entity frequently did so in an allusion to the new Europe. And this, I suggest, is no accident. As all post-colonial scholars will know, the New World was designated new precisely because the spaces of which the New World was comprised were points of transition and renewal. Neither the new of the New World then, nor the new Europe, when we spoke of it thus, can be understood to denote the thing or entity that will rise from the degradation of the old. Rather, the term new, then as now, is evocative of a figuratively empty space. Like the New World, the New Europe was a space that was ripe for change. It was not literally empty, but was used up or misused. And see, I would get the title in here. When we speak of the New Europe, it is in a kind of shorthand to characterize the old arrangement of nation-states as spent or obsolete. To be designated new is to bear the taint of the barbarian. The term new lays bare a political and social order that has reached its end point. It would then not be too much of an exaggeration to claim that all the certainties of the age of discovery have been brought forward to the present fashioning of the European Union. Above all, the belief that any community which does not beckon towards the future is effectively an empty space and of no account. In such a state, there is no enemy to conquer, no people with whom to negotiate a settlement. In such a state, it is possible to create a new concrete order, not through invasion or conquest, but through migration and settlement. As stated in the previous part, the appropriation of the European Union towards to the old Europe, to the European Union, has occurred in the time-honoured fashion of encouraging the most courageous and curious, most often too the economically advantaged, to test the new spaces, to discover to what extent its seeming dissolution can yield hidden riches. And this is what is truly interesting about the development of the European Union. Namely, the granting of the power to navigate the European space and thereby to effect the discovery of the European Union to a host of non-elite voyagers, whose qualifications for engaging in this age-old process of political formation rest entirely on their willingness and ability to seek economic advantage through productive migration. Is it to be marvelled at that citizenship of the European Union is almost entirely structured around the free movement principle? Those writers who criticise the European Union citizenship concept in its early disguise for seemingly offering no more to nationals of member states of the European Union than was already guaranteed them by the Four Freedoms, entirely overlook how marginal, indeed how practically irrelevant, abstract citizenship rights such as rights to participate in democratic elections are in the process of the formation of a new political and legal entity. It is through the continuous play of movement around the European space that the old scene of nation-states, surrounded by physical and fiscal barriers to movement, can be replaced by one that unequivocally pertains to the discoverer. I'll move to the last section. Earthly citizenship. The law of the earth lends a political community its constitutive force. It also determines the distribution of social and civic rights. So in this last segment, I hope to speak directly to the themes of law and trial, and to bring together research conducted during the early part of my academic career at the School of Law, University of East London, with more recently published work at Birkbeck. So I turn to the position of the refugee within the European Union, From the example of the refugee, I have argued that the development of the European Union corresponds with the discovery of the New World, not least in the ways in which individuals or groups most closely associated with the old scene that the new wishes to transcend are disavowed, left to the margins, excluded from the social and political realm, and from economic benefits. The contrast between refugees and European Union citizens, the European Union citizens who have engaged free movement, is a contrast between two of the four fundamental statuses that I argue a law of the earth can acknowledge. The contrast between a discoverer and nomad. In common with all discovered entities, the European Union will define itself through a radical break with all that came before it. Although conventional accounts of the emergence of the European Union are not immersed in the history of European discovery as is mine, they are faithful in depicting the process of its emergence in tension with the old nation-state form. But there, most accounts stop. To complete the description and analysis of the European Union's emergence onto the stages of the world, there must exist equally faithful accounts of the European Union's emergence in tension with individuals or groups made to symbolize the old nation-state form, and more generally, those groups made to symbolize the previous, the modern world in which that form developed. Controversially, perhaps, counterintuitively even, some might say, I argue that the refugee is the symbol of the old order that the European Union seeks to transcend. Put that more carefully, has been made to symbolize the old order that the European Union seeks to transcend. Thus, the repudiation of the refugee is the act, or will be the act, that signals also the transcendence of the nation-state. I would not be so confident as to argue that the refugee exclusively symbolises the old order. That would be to ignore other groups sacrificed to the ambitions of the European Union, the economic migrant, resident non-nationals, and so on. In my account, then, the refugee is not the sole, but the principal signifier of the bankrupt old order of Europe. Another brief reference to Peter Fitzpatrick, who has in the past observed that discussion of the European Union's emergence frequently emphasises what he describes as the badness of nation. Significant for my account is that the emphasis on what is bad about the state, or about any state that preceded the emergence of a new legal and political order, is not unique to discourses around the European Union, but is a discernible feature of discourses surrounding the emergence of other sovereign entities at different times and in different locations. One cannot state emphatically enough how important to the emergence of sovereign power is the presentation of alternative ways of political belonging as bad, savage, or warlike. Entirely in keeping with the history of sovereign emergence, the European Union could not have emerged other than against a backdrop of chaos and disorder. The project of European integration could only move forward on the basis of a determined looking back upon a savage wasteland in need of modernisation. It is its emergence from within a discursive terrain that juxtaposes the good post-nation union with the bad nation-state, strongly evident in all forms which speak about the European Union's history, presence and future, which betrays its origins within a far from unique process of sovereign emergence. More pertinently for this part, this is a discursive terrain which captures individuals, and on whom, as a consequence of this capturing, is meted the ultimate violence, that is, threatened extinction. It would hardly be a novel claim if I were to assert that the very survival of the refugee, the legal category and the sociological phenomenon, lies in the balance within the European Union. My contribution to discussion of the position of the refugee within the European Union is simply to offer the view that it is within a broader history of the emergence of sovereign entities that we might look to understand why the refugee's existence is threatened, in the faint hope that the spiraling process toward the complete disavowal of the refugee might be halted. So this would not be the first time that the figure of the refugee is advanced to expose the European Union's claim to a place somewhere beyond the violence of sovereign constituting. What I add is an elaboration of the place of the refugee and of international refugee law in the purported transition of Europe in space and time. When we hear of the vicious circle of violence that followed the sovereign state, or of the old order that held calamitous political structures, or of the state form that was immersed in a repetitive pattern of conflict, we see the grounds on which the EU asserts its identity. And it is a human subject that must make concrete the depiction of a vicious circle of violence. It is a human subject on which is embodied the conflict that the new order seeks to bury and transcend. The evocative descriptions of the development of the European Union from the long road of travel through the nation-state have no currency as mere words on a page, but only as reference to a concrete someone. The calamitous structures of the old order of Europe can only be really understood, really experienced, through the embodiment of chaos or crisis in someone. This someone, this refugee, is constructed by the same discursive practice through which the fundamental opposition between the good and the bad, the savage and the civil, is configured, as uniquely representing the now utterly discredited old order. Such, I suggest, is where the refugee has been placed within the European Union, stubbornly attached to the old modern order, antagonistic toward the new post-modern Europe. Of course, many others before me have argued that the European Union asserts itself against certain excluded others, within which grouping the refugee occupies place. I'm pushing the particular trajectory of inquiry that these discussions of Europe's others have opened, perhaps to its furthest limit. For me, the refugee is more than one of Europe's others. That is more than one of a number of identifiably non-Europeans against which a default definition of Europe is being constructed. She is the human remnant in the European Union of the old nation-state form, the principal signifier of the bankrupt old order. It is surely instructive in this regard that the only refugee who can come to the European Union, secure in the knowledge that a safe haven exists, has been endowed with all the negative attributes of the old European order. It is the refugee who suffers persecution on account of her or his nationality, religion, race, social group, membership or political opinion, who is accorded the reluctant hospitality of member states within the European Union. As critics of the asylum regime have consistently argued, these are not the forms of injury characteristic of contemporary refugee-producing phenomenon. A genuine attempt on the part of European Union member states to offer territorial asylum to a fair proportion of the world's refugees would thus see a more expansive legal definition of refugee. Yet, the preeminence of the Geneva Convention definition of refugee status remains. And what remains also, what inheres in the concept of refugeehood, at least as understood within the European Union, are those forms of injury for which the nation-state is famed. And so, by dint of a progressive reduction of the phenomenon of refugeehood to the Geneva Convention definition, the refugee enters the European Union burdened with all the attributes of nation. Being so endowed, the refugee is necessary to the European Union, but necessary only insofar as she operates to remind all of the chaos that threatens if the new order of the post-modern and post-national European Union is not embraced fully. Thus, the old bankrupt condition of the nation-state and the refugee are inextricably linked. One cannot be overborne without the simultaneous disavowal of the other. In the contemporary staging of the opposition between the primitive and advanced state, the progressive and the reactionary, the refugee, I suggest, occupies the position of the wandering tribes, deemed primitive in their social being. They're chaotic, static, and backward, who were displaced in the settlement of the New World. The European citizen who can exercise the famed 4 freedoms is, in the very exercise of those freedoms, the new postmodern citizen, empathizing exactly with the ambitions of the postmodern European Union. Those without the freedom to work, proffer services, transport goods, and transfer capital exist, at best, with the rights and freedoms associated with the old modern world. It is now almost folklore that refugee rights have been virtually stripped of all meaning in the securing of the European Union of its external borders, making around Europe a fortress against the incursion of migration from third states, including refugee migration. The freedom of movement of the European Union citizen is made a concrete reality against the relative curtailment of movement of the refugee. If the European citizen represents the progressive new world, the refugee is made to represent the now discredited old world. So when she is denied territorial asylum, she's not so much told that she does not suffer, but rather that her suffering, like that of so many before who have been sacrificed to other political revolutions, is a result of her failure to be modern, or in the case of the refugee, vis-à-vis the Union, to be postmodern. We have, through a deliberate process of construction, elements or aspects of which I have addressed, a thoroughly modern refugee residing in an avowedly postmodern Europe. I am content to conclude this presentation with the exact words of a conclusion to an essay I published 2 or 3 years ago. Far from being a polity that has emerged from a unique deployment of legal norms, the Discovery Doctrine has brought into being yet another sovereign entity that will soon have to confront the consequences of its intensive reorganisation of space. Like many sovereign entities that existed before, the European Union will know itself not through the trauma of revolutionary struggle, nor through the settlement of a constitutional document, but through its unique encounter with groups who represent or who carry the trace of a condition that must be overborne. These groups, carrying an indelible trace of the old order, cannot coexist with the new. The refugee, carrying so clearly the mark of the nation-state, will not be allowed to comfortably exist within the deterritorialized new Europe. Thank you.